Hey, my name is Ulrik, and I'm a B2B SaaS pricing consultant. I've run more than 150 B2B SaaS pricing projects for complex software products. And in this video, I'm going to tell you how I run projects, how I sort of think about structuring them, and what kind of phases I chop the project into, and what kind of organizational load you can expect. So across the different functions, from product to sales and so forth. This is something that has evolved for me over time. So I started doing pricing consulting maybe a decade ago, and I've consulted with both billion-dollar ARR companies, so legacy tech giants, and also early-stage startups and everything in between. Consulted with hardware companies wanting to go to SaaS, service companies wanting to supplement hourly-based services with software subscriptions and so forth. And so for me, it's been a lot of different sort of iterations on how to think about progressing whenever we want to create new pricing, how to implement it, how to make sure that it sticks, how to get the organization involved, and so forth. So I want to sort of walk you through first the process, sort of how I think about structuring this, then the 4 phases that I chop a project into, and then show you what kind of organizational load you can expect here. So to be clear, when I'm talking about a pricing project, I am not talking about just raising prices 5% and sending everybody an email and sort of handling the fallout for the few customers that react to that sort of thing. I think that is just what I would call a small adjustment or pricing change and so forth. When I'm talking about a pricing project, I'm talking about something more fundamentally new. So like changing your entire packaging structure, maybe changing your entire pricing model, like the way you price, maybe doing both. Maybe you're introducing a fundamentally new product into the mix that is going to change the way that your customers are buying what it is that you sell. Maybe is it also a case that you are changing from, let's say, a perpetual license to a SaaS license. Maybe you are, let's say, you bought a competitor, now you need to merge the two. So whenever we have large scale change like this, and we can expect customers to take a minute to sort of think about what it is that we give them in the new thing, this is the kind of process that I use. And the reason is that when you have these many variables, these many moving parts, a lot of things can go wrong. And that also means that you have a lot of things that you need to think about and decide on and so forth with the new pricing. If you're just index regulating sort of 4, 5, or 6%, basically that's the decision. Like, are we index regulating 4, 5, or 6%? When are we doing it? How do we tell people? So 3 decisions. I had a CRO in a recent project that we finished, and that was sort of a perpetual to SaaS migration in defense tech. And like offhandedly, I don't know how he arrived at the number. He said, I think that I had to make around 400 decisions in this project. Like there was just a lot of different decisions, and most of them made sense once they were made. But going into it, it's still a decision, and you have options, and you need to evaluate the options and so forth. So it's just a lot of the decision volume that you need to go through. So the North Star in all of this is that, as I'm concerned, and as I'm dealing with executive teams and founder teams, is that what typically tends to sort of break down the speed, sort of remove the momentum, sort of stall the project, whatever it is that you're doing, right, is that people don't know what the risk is. So they don't know what the consequences of these decisions are. So like, okay, we should go A or B. And they're like, okay, I have no idea if we're going to blow up the entire business if we go A or B. Like A seems more, let's say, lucrative if it works, but it's also more risky. And then people get stuck. So it's in all these decisions, because people don't have a way to handle risk, that pricing projects tend to either not get completed at all or get completed but under implemented. So we don't really do all the things that we had designed or set out to do. So the way I sort of come to think about this is that solving for risk essentially means the following. Imagine this. You have new pricing, and this new pricing sort of reconfigures the way you price, reconfigures the way your product packaging is put out, and you have sort of small, medium, big, and XL customers. And let's say that the new pricing suggests that the XL customers, like the few, like 5 strategic accounts you have, are heavily underpriced, and you should raise prices 600% of those. I actually just had an account where we raised prices from $350K a year to $1.8 million on their largest single account. So this is not fantasy numbers. These are real results that you can sometimes get when redesigning a model and taking a long, hard look at your accounts. So the way that we solve for risk in this scenario is that the CEO, because it's always the CEO, who has to make that call to that customer, say, hey, I want to meet to talk about your pricing. And then that meeting is, hey, pricing are going to go up from 350K to 1.8 million. In order for him to confidently take that meeting and give them that new price and stick to his guns, so to speak, in the negotiation, like not fold when they push back, because they are going to push back. We need to back him up in some way, because if the only thing he has is a spreadsheet that says that this would be great, then he is unlikely to do the call in the first place. But even if he does it, he is unlikely to actually stick to his gun and defend the price in the negotiation with the account. So we have to work backwards and then ask ourselves, what would need to be true in order for this executive to execute this plan? And very simply, you can say, if you were to raise prices 600% on your top 5 accounts, if you had just raised prices 600% on the 25 sort of next largest accounts, like the large batch, but not the Excel batch, like if you'd just done that, like first of all, you probably already would be in the green on a revenue particularly, and these would now be your largest customers. And the remaining sort of formerly largest accounts would actually be not the largest anymore. And also, you're just proven that it could be done. You just had all the practice, all the 25 meetings, and you're through that process. So now speaking to these last 5 largest accounts isn't actually that big of a deal. And this is exactly what happened in this call, is that we didn't go to the very largest account first. We actually went to some other larger accounts, and we had resolved that before we then went to the largest account. But then, of course, now the risk shifts, right? So we say, okay, so fair enough, we get that last step, but the step before, like taking this extreme price increase to the next, like the large segment, the 25 accounts that sort of sit close to the top of our list, like that's not an easy decision either. So how do we do that? So you just go back and you ask yourself, well, what would need to be true in order for us to go to these large accounts with the price increase? And you might say, well, if we just repriced everyone else, like all the smaller, mid-sized accounts, with like the long tail, the volume of accounts, if we just done that, then again, we would be in the green. We would have a lot of, let's say, practice narrating the new price, defending it, and so forth. And then going to this large batch would be maybe not that big of a deal. And then finally, of course, we roll it into the super large sort of strategic accounts. And then again, we shift back and say, okay, so fair enough, but raising prices 600% all the smaller accounts, even if we leave aside the larger ones for a while, that's also a big risk. But then you say, okay, so what would need to be true for us to dare that move? And then essentially my process here is, well, if you have just sold at this new price in the market to new accounts, wouldn't you be comfortable starting off with the long tail, like with the small accounts? If you just went out for a sales cycle, 2 sales cycles, actually sold these new higher prices, then probably you would be confident to at least try to start with the long tail. And when you then have that done, then you can go to large and then to Excel. So then we move the risk back and say, okay, so on new sales, what needs to happen for us to do this? We say, well, here we have maybe, at least from a structural perspective, shown the new pricing model, the new packaging, the USP, like all the way that it works to the customers, and they really like that. And maybe we've also tested some indications of new price points, and at least sort of the reference points, like what they're comparing the pricing to, isn't like completely off the map. Like we have confidence from interviews that they like the new thing and they understand how it works, which is all we need really to at least then try the new sales before we then start to migrate all the legacy or old customer base to the new pricing. And then prior to this, before we even show up in interviews and do this, we maybe show our internal teams how all this works. So we show it to sales, we show it to finance, we show it to product teams, customer success teams, all these and say, hey, this is how it works. And then we get feedback and, let's see, like we're not going to go straight to our largest account in the next step. We're just going to talk to customers. If they like it too, we're going to talk to new customers. We're going to bet a little bit of pipeline, see if it works. If it works, then we're slowly going to migrate the small, then the sort of mid-sized and large, and then the strategic accounts last. And the first step here is to simply come to an agreement in the executive team. Like I sat down with the CEO, his chief of product, his chief of sales, and we came up with a new pricing model. And we said, hey, I think based on the different data that we had, that we might be able to structure this differently, and we could raise prices on your key account from 350K a year to 1.8 million. Actually, that was the number. They got a bit of a discount at last, but we were having a material price increase in mind for these guys. And then, of course, he said, well, that might be well and good, but he didn't use those words. So I'm putting the words in his mouth. I don't have the courage to do that, right? He said, and he basically said, I don't know if that can be done. I think they will leave, which is a very fair comment at this point because you don't have the proof in the process yet, right? So this is the de-risking process, what I call the solve for risk here, right? So if we solve for risk by sort of working backwards to sort of say, okay, so if we want to end up at this end point in the project and we sort of start by ticking off these boxes from this other end, starting with key management, then going to internal teams, then going to customers and so forth, then how do we actually structure a project? So this is sort of the concept that sits behind the phases of a project as I do it. And the phases look something like this. So the 4 phases: design phase, validation phase, sales test, and then rollback or migration. You can use both words. So design phase, that's where we in the key management team decide on the new pricing. Validation, that's when we go talk to first internal teams, and then we talk to external teams and say, hey, and so that could be external teams, meaning customers and or channel partners, so distributors and so forth. And we say, hey, do you like the new pricing? If you do that, then we can take the sales test, like sell it to new customers for a while, and then through a renewal cycle, let's say if you have annual contracts, it's going to take at least a year for you to get through all of them, right? And you start with the smallest ones, then you go to mid-size, large, and then end up with the largest ones. And then that then happens. So essentially you think of it in these 4 phases in like design phase. And I usually spend sort of 1 to 4 weeks here with just like tops 5 people in the room, like head of sales, head of product, CEO, maybe an external consultant, and like a strategy guy or like a person that can execute across the organization and get stuff done, like something like that. Sit down, model the different things, can have an analyst as well, and figure out what you want to do, get to sort of a like solid version, like 2.0 of your pricing, and then you move it into validation. Then you talk to all your teams, like you take it to sales, you take it to product, and say, hey, tell me how this won't work. And then you make it a little bit better on these things. But you don't actually involve them in the like creative process because everybody has an idea about how pricing would go. And if you start to democratize the process too early, like involve too many people, you're never going to move forward. So you want to keep it small at the beginning, 5 people tops, before you then take it broad in the organization, before you show it to customers, and then sell it to new customers, and then roll it back to the existing customer base. And then at each of these steps, you reduce the risk, right? So at the design phase, because you actually have these people involved, and it's very deliberate that I'm saying head of sales, head of product, because those are the 2 key functions that you want in the room. So you want someone who is currently responsible for developing the product and are talking to a lot of users, right? And that's the product team. But you also want the person that is responsible for selling the product and is talking to a lot of buyers, right? Because a customer is essentially almost always made up of these 2 sort of key roles, like someone that is actually buying the software from you and someone that is then going to use the software, right? So if you sell Salesforce, for example, all the salespeople and the sales managers are the ones that are going to use the software, but it's the CEO that's going to buy the software, right? And you want to have both perspectives on pricing when you design the new thing, because you want the packaging and the pricing to really speak to the CEO so he can sort of see how the value is created through your software. But you also want it to actually speak to the user so they can see, okay, I know exactly how I'm going to actually sort of apply the solution into the way that I work and get some value out of it. And it's in the intersection between these 2 that you really get good packaging and good pricing. So small team there. And then validation, that is essentially a falsification exercise, not a creative exercise. So in the validation phase, you now have a new pricing model and you say, this is the one. And you blatantly admit that, hey, we don't know if this is perfect and it's definitely not optimal, but at least we think it's better than what we had. And then, so please tell us how we could make this better or how it wouldn't work, right? So what you're deliberately not doing is asking everybody in the organization to come with great ideas for how to do pricing, because you're going to get a lot of them and it's going to be really hard to consolidate all those ideas sort of into a coherent new model. So by picking the right people in the design phase, you have the different sort of voices and perspectives in the organization represented. And then once that has created a version 2.0 of the new pricing, then you just stress test it in the validation phase. You don't try to change it materially, just say, hey, like, will this work? And if you then sort of get some red flags and people say, hey, that is illegal, or we can't execute it, or whatever it is, then you need to change something. But that then is pulled back into the design phase, like the core team that does that, before you then sort of try to validate it again. So you go design validation until you have something that sort of passes validation, and then you can sort of push it into a sales test, at which point, whenever something sort of hits reality, a few things are going to, be clear to you that weren't before. So you make minor changes often in the sales test to the way discounts work, or the way you like narrate something, or the way something is set up, and that's fine. And then once you have something that really works well, then you can start to migrate or roll back to the old customer base. So the way that this looks in the organization. So number 1, solve for risk. Number 2, the 4 phases. And then 3, organizational load. Is that on the top here, we have these 4 phases: design phase, validation phase, sales test, and then here I call it not rollback, but migration of legacy customers. And then on the vertical axis here, I have the different stakeholders to this project. And here at the top, I have what I just call the core team. So the 5 people that do the design, like head of sales, head of product, and so forth, like something like that. And then probably you want to have the project manager that sort of runs the thing, books the meetings, like gathers the data, does all these things. You want to have an analyst that crunches the numbers. Then you want to have the product teams that they then have to execute the new banking and maybe provide some feedback if ever there's something that's unclear. You want to have the sales teams and RevOps who actually have to sort of sell the new thing. You want to have marketing that also needs to sort of change their messaging, and they might be wanting to sort of announce something whenever let's say you introduce a new product, depending a little bit on what the project is. And you have customer success teams who, of course, need to deal with customers when they hear about a change. You want to have finance. They are involved in like making sure that like they have to sign off on the risk usually. And then also in finance, you also want to consider the billing part and the invoicing part, sort of the whole like quote to cash flow or workflow across finance. They need to sign off on that too. And then of course you have your customers and channel partners. So those are external. And then you might have other, that might be the board or your investors or vendors or strategic partners and so forth that could or could not have an opinion on this. So essentially in the design phase, so phase 1, I use this for my own project. So this is actually something that I sometimes send to my clients. They'll say, hey, expect that we have 2 meetings a week. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 1. But we want to have sort of for a 4-week sprint, let's say, we want to have a cadence where we are regularly moving forward, like several times a week. We're getting like new decisions in the book. We're evaluating something. We're sketching something. We're coming up with a packaging design, and then we can move forward. The project manager is sort of spinning his or her wheels, like making sure all this works, making sure that the people that we want to talk to are booked for interviews and so forth, making sure that all the data is there and so forth. And then the analyst sort of crunches the numbers. Let's say, oh, if we want to shift from usage-based to price per API call, and then the model would look like this. We would get these kinds of numbers from the existing accounts. Or if we wanted to introduce a flat fee, but only for the enterprise accounts, then it would look like this. Or if we like gave the previous support away for free, and so forth, right? So they need to sort of quantify all the decisions so that the core team can make decisions based on that quantification, right? So they are heavily involved in this sort of first part of the process. Product teams are a little bit on the back burner here. They know that it exists, the project. They can provide some input. They usually have to provide some, whenever I work with them, product teams, work with the client, product teams are the one who's described the current product, like tells me what works, what doesn't work, and so forth. Sales, again, they're aware the project exists, but they don't need to be involved. Marketing, same. CS, same. And finance might have like a little bit of a head start here, like especially if we know that we're going to change the pricing model. So let's say we are changing it from like a license to a usage-based. We want to let finance know now so that they can start preparing for being able to invoice on a usage-based model, right? But if that's not the case, they also do not need to be involved at this early stage. And also customers and channel partners, if you want to talk to them early to get input to the design, do that. If you feel that everybody in the room already knows what you need to know, you don't need to talk to them at this point. And then in the validation phase, that's where you then start to involve a lot of these from a validation perspective. And then, so they start to sort of ramp up more, especially sort of product teams start to now, if you have made packaging changes, start to then implement those packaging changes because you need to then move into the sales test. Sales teams, they start to prepare to go into the sales test. And then, of course, finance needs to prepare to send invoices and so forth. Marketing, they can do some, depending on what kind of launch you have. CS teams are usually not too involved here unless they run some of the external validation. And then you have the sales test. But in between, you have a gap. And the gap, I put it in because sometimes you just figure out, like you validate something, you get really positive results like this. The numbers say yes, and you say, hey, this is definitely what we want to do. But there just is a development phase where you say, oh, we need to reconfigure the way the product is built in this way in order to sell it this new way that we have envisioned. Maybe finance needs to be able to have a little bit of time to prepare the user-based billing or whatever it is that you envisioned. So that can sometimes like just pause things. Like you already know what you're going to do. You're just not ready to execute it yet. So you just like execute all that, like you check all the boxes before you can then launch it in new sales. So you then launch the sales test, runs for, let's say, 3 months for sales cycle. Usually in 3 months, you sort of know, right? So I usually say that if something works really well or really not well, you will know really fast, right? So if you launch something in sales and you just instantly make more money, it's like great. Like we don't need to necessarily like run it for the full 6-month sales cycle. If we can already see the first 3 months that, we have very positive customer conversations. They like the new model. They see the pricing. It's not an issue. Like we don't have the kind of friction and so forth. So we'll just move ahead there, right? And then, of course, in the migration with the legacy customers, what I usually do here is like, this is where sales are now not that involved, depending on how you have account management and so forth. Product, not that involved. But CS teams are involved. Some sales teams are involved. And sometimes you have the senior management involved again, especially with some of these strategic accounts. So what I usually do is I take a look at everything we have going on. So especially if we have a lot of new sales goals, then maybe sales shouldn't be that involved in repricing all customers. Maybe it's more like a customer success task. If we have some very, very key strategic accounts, that definitely is the CEO who wants to do that and so forth. So, but for each of these functions, customer success, CEO, and so forth, you sort of figure out, okay, what is the execution budget? Like how much time do we want to spend on this? And then you say, okay, so the CEO is, busy because she is a CEO. So she wants to do she can handle like 10 of these migration accounts. Like that's the maximum. The rest just needs to be handled by someone else. And then you sort of pick the 10 accounts that are going to be like CEO owned for the migration. And then maybe you have, let's say, 500 other accounts and you say, okay, these 100 accounts are sort of important. So we are going to like have a meeting with them, like explain everything, like invest in the relationship. But these other 400 accounts, they're so small, so we're just going to send them an email, right? We're just going to let them know that they now have new pricing, right? And then we're going to handle the fallback in, however it may come. So because what you realize at this point is that, of course, it would be better if each and every account of the 500 accounts you have would get a meeting and lunch and, an explanation and you hold their hand and all this. But you don't have time for that because you have a business to grow. So what you need to do is you say, hey, I have this much time, and then you need to spend that intelligently on, let's say, in the best possible way with the customers you have, right? And then that is usually how you progress through this. Because if you go into sort of fear mode and you say, oh, like we need to do everything like 100%, then you're just never going to get it done. And what's going to happen is that you actually don't reprice your old customers and you just get the benefit from the new sales, which might still be good, but it's just creating sort of a lot of sort of before and after, and there you have different sort of customers in your portfolio. It creates what I call commercial debt. So differences in the portfolio, which is just harder to operationally handle. So generally, you don't want that. You want the money and you want sort of the cleanness of everybody being on the same plan. So that's the idea. That is how I run pricing projects. So just to iterate, solve for risk, work backwards from how do we do the hardest thing and then what needs to be true for us to be able to do that all the way down through the design. That then reverse into this 4-step process. Design first, small team, validation, internal and external, broader, then new customers, sales test, and then old customers, migration, rollback. And then the organizational load looks something like this. So I've done maybe 100 of these projects, if not more. I've done them in regulated industries. I've done them in defense, communication tech, med tech, legal tech, marketing tech, and for, let's say, early stage scale-ups, like a couple million ARR, like mid-sized businesses, 30, 50, 80 million ARR to several hundred million ARR businesses and product lines. And it sort of works. It's one of these things where universally applied, this is at least as I find it, a really good model to like run an organization through what is actually or can be a relatively large change. Like you can spend a year talking a lot about pricing across the organization. But if you do it this way, you actually only spend that year and you get all the results, which can be dramatic, right? So if you want to invest in that sort of thing and say, hey, we actually think we have a material upside in the way that we price, then this can definitely be worth your while and be sort of the most important thing that you do in the next 12 months. It is going to affect every part of your business, and it is going to be a transformation. But if you have these sort of 30, 40, 50, 100% uplift opportunities, then definitely that is what you're looking into. If you're just, again, doing sort of a 5-10%, just like increasing the number, but everything else stays the same, then it's not a project, it's just an adjustment, and you can like do it in, say, a couple of weeks with the right people. So at least this is how I do it. I hope it was helpful to you and that it gives some clarity on what you're looking into if you're looking into a pricing project. And of course, if you want sort of other resources, have a bunch of our website, willingness2pay.com, or on this YouTube channel or elsewhere. So good luck to you. Once you get going, it's actually quite a lot of fun. Cheers.